How's your health, Paige? You okay?
Yes, doing well, thank you. So,
If people want to say hello and your state, we have a couple minutes before we get started. Hi, Steve.
Hi, Kathy.
Hi. Hi, Steve Richardson.
Should we put our state in the next to our name?
What, Marge? You can just say hello and your state.
Hi. Should
Hi.
we put our state next to our name?
You can if you want to. Sure.
Sure.
Hi, Sue Davies from New Jersey.
Hi, Sue.
Mike Rukowski, Arizona. 110.
110. Okay.
Yeah.
wow.
Hi, I'm Ashley Fahey. I live in Ohio, but currently joining from Michigan.
Welcome. Great to see you.
Yay, Ohio. What part of Ohio?
Near Akron.
Oh, I went to school near Akron in Hudson.
I work at Goodyear.
Oh, okay, there you go.
I'm Don McGill from Jacksonville, Florida.
Hi, Don. Welcome.
I grew up about 50 miles north of Lansing.
Oh, wow. Okay.
That's awesome. This is Paige. I'm in Lansing right now, so.
There's the good author himself.
Okay. Well, we're going to just a few more seconds and we're going to start, everybody.
Hi. Hi, my name is Jana. I'm from Gilbert, Arizona.
Welcome.
I'm in Phoenix, Jenna.
Hi, Mike.
How are you?
Good. What part of Phoenix?
North Phoenix, right by North Mountain.
Oh, that's nice. Beautiful.
Yeah, went hiking there this morning. It's too hot.
Yeah.
You have to go real early.
I did, yeah.
Hello, everybody. This is Patrick McWhorter. I'm in Cave Creek, Arizona.
Hi, Patrick. Great to hear your voice.
Good to finally be on that. I think I did this once a long time ago.
Yes, thanks everyone for joining Zoom. We're so excited to see everyone.
Phil Leach from Michigan.
Hi, Phil.
Hi, Kathy.
Hi, Phil.
Sadie Stewart from Cleveland Heights.
Welcome, Sadie.
Michigan.
Hi, Phil.
Hi, Kathy.
Hi, Phil.
Okay. Joyce Statner, New York City.
Hi, Joyce. Great to
Hi,
see
Kathy.
you.
Hello, everyone. Great to see you.
Benita here in Sarasota, Florida. Gotcha.
Hi, Benita.
How you doing?
Good. How are you?
Hot.
Yeah, I can imagine.
It's in the 90s today. Too hot too soon. Okay.
I think Arizona beat you today. We just heard a report it's 110.
Oh, but it's
What?
like
In the shade, in the shade. you know.
Okay.
it's dry heat there though.
Get out of the shade.
Close my oven.
It's a cool dock, Kathy.
Oh,
Yeah.
good. Good. Glad to hear that, Al. Okay, so we are gonna
humidity.
we're gonna get started, everybody. So if you could mute yourselves.
Okay.
Okay, I'll give you a sec to do that.
And
How do we mute?
Do you see where the mute
How do we
button is?
mute?
On the bottom of your screen, there's a little microphone. Okay. Or else, okay, I think we're good. Okay. It's great to see everybody joining us from around the country. I'm Kathy Stewart, and this is the Politics for the People Book Club. A special hello to all of our first-time book club participants. I wanted to start us off tonight by sharing with all of you that when I woke up this morning, I woke up thinking, should we hold our call tonight at all? I was so upset, horrified by the killing of George Floyd in broad daylight, by the complicity and the silence of the 3 other officers, by the despair and the sense of hopelessness that so many people feel, and the protests which include both peaceful demonstration and acts of violence by some. So I thought, what am I doing hosting a conversation about political reform? That seems at best inadequate and at worst irrelevant. But then I took a breath. I had a cup of tea. For those of you that know me, you'll recognize this is a pandemic departure from my usual Diet Pepsi. And I thought about the situation that we are facing together and talked to some very dear friends and colleagues about the picture and my question. I spoke at some length with my husband, Harry Kresge, who's a longtime activist and civil and voting rights attorney. And in those conversations, it became clear to me that not only should we have the conversation, we had to have the conversation tonight. In addition to all the things that we're all doing, and I know that many of you have been at some of the demonstrations this weekend, have been commenting on social media and working to express our desire for justice and change. And we need to keep doing all of those things. I feel like this is the perfect grouping to have this particular conversation tonight. Why? Well, we have a profound and systemic problem. The political processes that we use for self-governance are failing us, not only in some abstract sense, but literally in the last 50 years of partisan politics, preying on the tendency in America toward division and hatred, and exploiting that tendency to win elections and to keep elected officials in line. I chose the road a long time ago of being an independent and being involved in the independent, nonpartisan political movement, because while I deeply care about social justice and ending poverty and healthcare, since I was a young community health nurse more than a couple of years ago now, I have come to believe that unless and until we transform our political system and the way we choose leaders, we are going to be unable to address the profound failures in social policy and address the social and moral issues that we face. So we need to have this conversation together tonight. I'm delighted that you all felt the same way. It is great to see everyone on our first Politics for the People on Zoom. I just want to add one more thing. This conversation tonight is one of many conversations across the country that Americans are having, where we're discussing and sharing and evaluating ideas and actions that we can take so that every American can live a life that's free from fear, from violence and poverty, and live in a country with a government that is responsive and accountable to us. So with that, let's get started. It's really such a pleasure to welcome tonight's author and guest, David Daley. David is a senior fellow at Fair Vote and the former editor-in-chief of Salon. He's the author of the 2016 bestseller, Rat Effed. You can fill in what that really is, Why Your Vote Doesn't Count. Dave is a frequent lecturer and media source about gerrymandering. He is also featured along with Katie Fahey, the executive director of The People, who is with us this evening, in the documentary Slay the Dragon that outlines the 2018 fights for redistricting reform, including the successful Voters Not Politicians campaign that Katie led in Michigan that energized over 14,000 Michiganders, which Dave writes about in chapter 5 in his new book. Dave, great to have you back at Politics for the People.
Thank you for having me, Kathy.
Yeah, we're really
glad to be here.
Yeah,
I echo everything you said at the beginning. Thank you for saying that so eloquently.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you, Dave, for that. Yeah, it's great to be digging in and read and talking and sharing your new book, Unrigged: How Americans Are Battling Back to Save Our Democracy. In the book, you chronicle some of the heroes and citizen leaders that worked so hard in 2018 to try to make our democracy more inclusive and responsive to the American people. So let me jump right in. Let me premise this by sharing with everyone how tonight's call is going to work. I have a couple questions for Dave. Actually, I have a ton of them, but I'm only going to ask a couple. And then we're going to turn to your questions. So if you have a question, put it in the chat with your name and your state, and then I will call on you and you'll be able to ask your question. And tonight our call will run till 8 o'clock. So Dave, let me kick us off with a question. We had the pleasure of talking with you after Rat-Eft came out, which details how the Republican Party really weaponized gerrymandering, a tactic that's been used by both parties, of course, but really their effort to be situated to take advantage of gerrymandering after the 2010 census. I wanted to ask you to share your journey from writing Rat-Eft to writing Unrigged. How did you come to write a book about these citizen-led initiatives and campaigns to improve our democracy?
Thank you for that question. Thank you for doing the book club. Thank you to people and independent voters and Kathy and Katie and Paige and everybody else and everybody who's done all these thoughtful critiques over the last couple of weeks. I really appreciate it. It's incredibly moving and generous of all of you. You know, I did, as you mentioned, we did this call a couple of years ago, and I often in those days felt as if I had this dark, stormy rain cloud over my head. I was the character in Peanuts who was always bringing the storm cloud. You know, I was talking about these big systemic problems and sort of the knots that our democracy had been tied up in. And especially after the election in 2016, I often would find myself in rooms where people wanted to talk about what they could do. And I was talking about the problem and how hard it would be. And I started looking for solutions. And I heard some of those solutions on the call that I was on with all of you. You know, I think Katie may have even been on that call, and, you know, a bunch of other people in Michigan. And I heard them talking about how they were gonna tilt it, slaying that big old dragon, you know? And I started looking for more examples of hope to sort of wind up the talks that I was giving. And I would talk about the citizens in Wisconsin who were, you know, about to be at the Supreme Court. And they were regular citizens who started meeting in a tea room in Wisconsin to talk about what they could do. And they landed on the doorstep of the court and, you know, a technical decision on standing away from changing our democracy. And I saw what was going on in Michigan. I saw the other states in which independent redistricting fights were happening. And I said to myself, I could be of some use here trying to tell these stories. The world didn't need another book about how democracies die. We had plenty of those. We need a book about how determined people were to stand up and fight back for this democracy. And the examples were everywhere. All you had to do was go out and look around.
So helpful to hear you talk about that, Dave, and that the examples were everywhere, if you were looking for them. And one of the things that I loved about the book was the choice that you made to go on the road in 2018. In other words, you could have, as a journalist, as a very skilled journalist, interviewed people, done the research, but you made the decision to knock on doors in Michigan, to travel in the green Medicaid Express van in Idaho. You registered voters in Alabama. You rolled up your sleeves alongside the activists that you wrote about. And I think that really, my experience is it gave us a kind of intimacy and immediacy in reading the book, in how you were able to capture people's passions and the challenges. Can you share a bit about the decision to not just report on the stories, but to actively participate and spend time in each of the key states you write about?
It was an honor and a thrill of a lifetime to go out and ride along with these activists as they made this unbelievably amazing change. I mean, it was, every day was amazing, you know? I mean, and I learned so much. You know, I could have done these interviews from home, I guess, or made a couple of phone calls. You know, but if I had done that, I wouldn't have had the experience of walking up this driveway in Idaho Falls, Idaho, on this hot summer day in this Mormon town in the eastern hills of Idaho, with these activists who were determined to get a Medicaid expansion on the ballot in a bright red state where it had never, legislators had no interest in going there. So a handful of young people, late 20s, early 30s, decided they would start this campaign. They launch it, they buy this RV, they go around the state, they get it on the ballot. And the day that I'm out there, we are going door to door in Idaho Falls just to remind people that it's on the ballot, they've got to vote yes. And we walk up this driveway, and there's a bumper sticker on this truck that says, Vietnam, we were winning when I left. And I'm thinking, maybe we should just go to the next house, guys. They were winning in Vietnam when this guy was there. He might not want to talk to us about Obamacare, but they didn't notice it. They just marched right on up to that door, and they knocked on the door, and they started talking to this guy. And it turned out he and his family fell in that Medicaid gap as well. And as they talked to him, he said, yes, I know about this. I signed your petition. I'm voting yes. And it was that kind of persuasion, this kind of transpartisan persuasion, this sort of going up and talking to your neighbors, that was the solution there in Idaho, you know. And I think that was the solution in Michigan and in Florida on felon voting rights and all over the place. You see the most amazing things when you go out and do this. I mean, I want to tell the Alabama story quickly, just because I don't want to stand in the way of questions, but
Please do.
I don't think I've ever experienced anything quite like this. We're in Birmingham, Alabama, and we are trying to register. Well, the state of Alabama had for 140 years since Reconstruction, they'd had something called moral turpitude. And if you were convicted of a felony involving moral turpitude, you were not allowed to vote. You lost your voting rights. And moral turpitude could be defined however the largely white local voting boards wanted to define it. In the middle of the 2010s, finally, Alabama, under the threat of court order, lifted moral turpitude. They just didn't tell anybody or lift a finger to try to register the folks who would have been able to vote. So these groups decided to go out door to door, barbershop to bus station to library to grocery store, and ask people and to try to sign them up. And I joined them one summer morning at the Birmingham bus station. Birmingham, of course, a city with its own amazing and tragic history on civil rights. And we walk up to this woman, and she was in her mid to late 30s, obviously about to go to her job at probably a fast food place. She was wearing a uniform. And she sort of pushed me away the way that they trained me. People don't necessarily want to admit that they've got a felony conviction, especially to a white guy in the morning on their way to work. But it turned out she got interested once I said, we're informing people of a change in the law that they can get their voting rights back. And she got interested and she said, well, no, I can't vote. I've got a conviction. And it was a conviction for marijuana possession at the age of 17.
Wow.
She was in her late 30s. She lost her voting rights before she ever had the chance to use them, forever, for something so minor that it's not even illegal in most states at this point in time, right? And we signed her up on the spot and gave her her voting rights back. And you just can't imagine the emotion of a moment like that. So if I hadn't gone out and done it this way, you can look at all the statistics and all the years that this has been in place to meet the people who have never been able to vote as a result of these policy choices, who've been trapped, even in 2018, trapped in these Jim Crow civil era laws. It's something else to see.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's take some questions. Let me go to Jesse Fields. You have a question about nonpartisan elections, Dr. Fields?
Yes, I do. Thank you very much. Thank you, Kathy, for your statement. I think this is a very relevant time to make the political process directly responsive to and inclusive of all people. And Dave, a key feature of the initiatives that you describe in the book is that they are nonpartisan, citizen-driven coalitions that include Democrats, Republicans, and independents across partisan, racial, and ideological divides. But when those people who have come together in this inclusive way, when those people go to vote for candidates in states such as Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Florida, and in fact in almost all the states, even the ones with open partisan primaries, they will be divided again. So legislators elected in closed partisan primaries have been found to be less responsive to a broad range of voters. And that division insulates elected officials from the voters, and the initiatives that are supported by a broad range of voters, such as the Florida Rights Restoration Initiative to restore voting rights to formerly incarcerated individuals, or the Michigan Voters Not Politicians redistricting reform, these initiatives may be watered down or reversed by the legislature. So there are ongoing efforts to change the partisan, divisive structure of our elections. And there was the exciting 2010 California victory for the ballot initiatives for top 2 nonpartisan elections and redistricting reform. Currently, there is in St. Louis the campaign for St. Louis Approves, which is for approval voting and for a nonpartisan top 2 system. And also the Florida Let All Voters Vote ballot initiative for nonpartisan elections will be on the ballot this November. So what are your thoughts on these campaigns for nonpartisan elections? Dave.
Thank you. That's a great question. I appreciate it. There's a lot there. Listen, our system is broken, and it's broken in so many ways around polarization, around partisanship. If you've looked at Lee Drutman's new book, which I think is terrific, Closing the Two-Party Doom Loop, or Ezra Klein's book on polarization, which is new, or Heather Cox Richardson's new books on the South and the Civil War. I think they're all terrific on this topic. We have become so deeply, our party has become so closely wrapped up with identity, and it's all happened in a way that has put more pressure on a two-party system than it's able to actually handle. And so I think you're right. What we see is that when independent redistricting is on the ballot in Michigan, in Missouri, in Colorado, in Utah, in Ohio, it wins 60, 70% of the vote. What we see in Florida is when, Second Chances is on the ballot, it wins with 64% of the vote.
Right.
What we see in Idaho is when Medicaid expansion is on the ballot, or in Nebraska, it wins above 60% of the vote. Ranked choice voting in Maine, all of these initiatives, all of these ideas are very, very popular. But our political system isn't set up to deliver them. Part of that is our polarization. Part of that is polarization has been exacerbated by gerrymandering and all kinds of ways in which politicians are no longer accountable to voters. Indeed, they've become insulated from voters and they don't need to listen. I I think we've seen many examples of that, right? Whether it's in the personhood amendments that have been pushed in states that are, far more stringent on abortion, the prohibitions than even voters in Georgia and Alabama are interested in, whether it's what the legislature in Florida did on the Second Chances Amendment, whether it's what the legislature in Maine did on ranked choice voting, whether it's all of the things that have been tacked on to all of these ballot initiatives around the country that were so successful. So I think we need to find new and creative ways to get ourselves out of this. And I think top 2 is very creative and interesting. I think top 4 is even better, right? I think ranked choice voting offers, a real possibility here. Approval voting, all of these methods that find a way to get us back to 50% plus 1 again in a general election, right? Because that's what gerrymandering does. I mean, gerrymandering, it makes general elections non-competitive. It moves all the action to the party primary, and nobody shows up in the primary, and you get 15% turnout in July, and it's the most committed partisans. Final 5 with RCV, yes, absolutely. That is what happens, and it pushes our system just into breakdown, into absolute breakdown. And I don't think it needs to be. I mean, if you look at all of these issues, and it doesn't even have to be these democracy initiatives, it's healthcare, it's guns, it's immigration. There's a road forward. It's simply that our political system hasn't been set up in such a way as to make it work. And the politicians who are in charge are trying to hang on to control, and they're fixing the system in ways that work for them, but not for the rest of us. Yeah. We need to make it a laboratory of democracy again, not a meth lab of democracy.
Thanks, Jesse.
I'm sorry for the long answer. There's a lot in that question.
Yes, there is. There's another whole book in that question. Yes. Yeah, thank you. Let's go to David Belmont. Dave, rather than my reading it, just go right ahead and ask your question. You might have to unmute.
I think so. Thank you, Kathy.
There you go.
So, Dave, most of what people were able to achieve in effecting process changes in 2018 was done through the citizens' initiative process. However, only 20 states have this process. Would you favor a national citizens' initiative process? For example, if the nation had an initiative process that allowed citizens to pass constitutional amendments, 18 states have this, we could implement nonpartisan redistricting for congressional elections nationwide. So what are you thinking about national INR?
I think you're absolutely right. All of the major gains in 2018 came through the initiative, and the states that don't have that are going to have a lot harder time getting these kinds of reforms. I think we have to look pretty carefully at the initiative, and I am perfectly in favor of the idea. I mean, I think about California and sort of how a ballot can get drowned, and special interests and dark money can kind of step in and overwhelm that. And I think we have to be careful about constitutional amendments, and especially in this day and age. But I certainly think that the spirit there is absolutely right on. Whenever we can try to handle these issues as voters and citizens, it's better than handling these issues filtered through politicians who have been set up in districts in which they don't have to actually represent us. That system is broken beyond repair, and well, it's not broken beyond repair. We can fix it. They won't fix it. So if it requires, that kind of action to fix it, absolutely, I'm with you. I mean, I would just say Virginia redistricting is an interesting story, right? Because here there's no initiative and organized citizen pressure. You know, a really incredible job by this group, One Virginia, years and years of activism, managed to pull together Democrats, Republicans, and independents, and convince both the Republican legislature in 2018 and a Democratic legislature in 2019 to hand over, not all, but some control over this process. And it's more control than any state legislature has ever voluntarily handed off before. And that happened without an initiative. It happened as a result of organizing and citizens speaking up.
And that's going to be interesting. That's on the ballot this November. Let me go to Katie Fahey. Katie Fahey. Hi, Katie.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks, Kathy.
Yeah.
Dave, I think that in this moment, you can just see and feel, and all my friends, but also people I work with, talk to across the country, people so recognize the systemic problems and the failures. And they want to make change, but where to channel that energy or where to know what the right change is sometimes really hard. That feeling feels really familiar to me. I think I made a Facebook post last time I was feeling this way. So I was just wondering if you were noticing any similarities in the timing, but also with you getting to meet so many people across the country who decided to go, you know, beyond their day jobs to want to really sometimes upturn their lives to try and make change. Were there any similarities in those moments when people went from kind of like thoughts to action, or any other things, I guess, that you just noticed that was similar between the people who were spearheading these things?
It's a really good question. Thank you, Katie. Rock star. A Facebook post that changes the history of redistricting in Michigan. I mean, it's absolutely amazing. You know, I think if you look at what unites people, people woke up and they realized that the change they wanted to make was not beyond their ability, that they had something to offer to the process and that they could simply join it. You know, I mean, I think about Reclaim Idaho, and Reclaim Idaho is started by two couples, and two of them had gone to school in Sandpoint, Idaho. And I mean, Sandpoint's been in the news a lot lately as kind of a hotbed of right-wing activism. And they couldn't get a school levy passed in Sandpoint. And it just kept being voted down, and they were about to have to close 2/3 of all these regional schools and lay off all of the teachers, and it was going to be a nightmare. And one of the founders was in medical school, and the other founder was in graduate school at Columbia in New York. And they realized that their hometown needed them, and that they maybe had some skills that could be useful as far as helping organize people and talk to them. You know, Luke had been taking political science classes, and he had, you know, he'd read some books about organizing, and, you know, had some ideas that could be contributed. And they went home and they spent a weekend determined that door-to-door contact was the best way to do this. And they won. And they turned it around, and that by going out and talking to people, they realized that something that had been voted down 2-to-1 suddenly won 2-to-1. Someplace where other people had just given up thinking that change was possible. And I think that really opened their eyes. And I think you probably had a similar experience. I think Desmond Meade has a similar experience in Florida. You know, I think all of these activists kind of realize these are big structural problems, but the way to push back is sort of one brick at a time, right. And that each of us have skills that can be useful to a movement. And when we start talking to our neighbors, the kind of change that can be made is sometimes change that we just can't even imagine otherwise. And once people begin doing that, and they see what happens and how that makes them feel, and the connections that get made, and the power of the people again, I think it gets kind of intoxicating, right? I mean, Reclaim Idaho starts off as a school levy, and they say, no, we caught the bug. We're in this. We're going to buy an RV and go after, healthcare expansion. So I think that's where it starts. All of us have something to offer. I know you've told the story so many times about you had a shop worker, right, who was able to make the special clipboards you all needed to carry. And people don't think about this, but if you're going to send 14,000 volunteers across the state to collect 435,000 signatures, they need a clipboard, and the clipboard's got to be the actual size that these papers are. And these papers are like legal form. And if you go to Staples and say, I need 14,000 clipboards, they're going to say, okay, $50,000, please. And your movement is over before it starts, because you don't have $50,000 at that point in time. But you've got people who can contribute things, and they step up and they do it. And before you know it, you've amended the Constitution in Michigan.
Yeah, I think what you're describing, Dave, and such a great question, Katie, is that the American people are building new muscles, or muscles that we've forgotten that we have. And they're the muscles of democracy and participation and owning our government and its mechanisms. Yeah.
We maybe didn't think we had to use them.
Right.
And honestly, when our government is functioning properly, we shouldn't have to use them. Something is profoundly broken when we need to, in some ways, go to war with our own representatives over questions of representative democracy. It's not as if anybody wants to spend their weekends and nights and evenings circulating petitions and camping out at rest areas in Michigan, or driving town to town in Idaho, or doing all the hard work that, it shouldn't have to be necessary, but it is. And when we do the work, we can make the change we want to see happen.
Let's go to Steve Richardson from Virginia. Steve, you just have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, does that work?
It works, yes.
All right, thanks. Hey, thanks, Dave, for writing the book, and thanks for joining us again. I really enjoyed the stories, but I absolutely loved the conclusion. And there's one statement in particular that I think is worth repeating to everyone before I pose the question. You said that democracy has been broken, quote, actively and intentionally by partisans who put their narrow ideological interests above all else, who chose to aggressively suppress and ignore the will of the people rather than committing themselves to listen to and represent all the citizens of a vibrant and ever-changing nation, unquote. I believe representing all the citizens means looking beyond those who identify as party members to the 43% of voters who, as independents, do not have equal rights. You agree that both major parties have failed us, and what do you think they should do to represent us?
Yes, I think you're right. I think both parties have failed us, and I think that a two-party system has failed us. I think these two parties have failed us, and that the trouble is, it's so hard to see structural ways around and through that, because of all of the things folks have identified in other questions. Districting, the primaries. We really need to fundamentally rethink all of these mechanisms. I am a big fan of a proposal by Congressman Don Beyer of Virginia, which he calls the Fair Representation Act, which would bring multi-member districts and ranked choice voting to Congress. So instead of 435 single-member winner-takes-all districts that can be gerrymandered either to maximize one party's advantage if they control the lines, or buddy-mandered by both sides to divide up the seats between the two and protect each other. What you see is multi-member seats and ranked choice voting. So you would fundamentally reimagine what's possible in Congress. I live in Massachusetts. Massachusetts has had one Democratic governor since Michael Dukakis. So there are Republicans who live here in the People's Republic of Massachusetts. But the state's congressional delegation is 9-0, and there hasn't been a Republican elected to the House from Massachusetts since 1994. So if you're a Republican in Massachusetts, if you're an independent, you're not really represented very well here. You know, I'd say the same if you're a Democrat in Kansas or Oklahoma or, you know, a lot of other places. So if you were to divide Massachusetts into 3 districts of 3 and use ranked choice voting to elect members, you would suddenly completely change who gets elected and who gets sent to Washington. And then you would also change how they're incentivized to vote once they're there. You know, you might see 5 Democrats and 2 Republicans and 2 independents represented out of Massachusetts. Those Republicans might be the kind of liberal Republicans that I grew up with in Connecticut, like, you know, Lowell Weicker and Stuart McKinney, you know, folks who were, I mean, heroes of mine growing up. You might get conservative Democrats out of, you know, Kansas and Oklahoma who could be bridge builders to the other side. I think that's the kind of thing that we're lacking is, you know, you see it in the voting records of members and the ideological position of members. It's all just gotten pushed so off to the left and to the right, and you've lost that entire overlap in the middle where the art of politics as trying to build consensus and solve problems has just disappeared. And I think we have to really reimagine the system if we want to get a different outcome.
Let's go to, thank you for that question, Steve. Thanks, Dave. Let's go to Bryce in Kansas.
Yes, thank you. I would like to know if the author thinks it would make sense to have some form of a moderated national conversation about what changes are needed to make representation work. For me, I haven't met anyone who can sustain an argument that voting alone can ever lead to true, genuine, and broad representation. Yet so much of the work being done seems to be around voting reform. I suspect working together would produce better final outcomes with profoundly new ideas, and in fact likely alone bring the country together through shared basic interests. If you agree that such a discussion would make sense, also, do you have any ideas who might be able to encourage and moderate this discussion?
Katie Fahey.
I'd be happy to talk to her if she'd talk to me.
We
would love
to happen, right? We can definitely make that conversation happen.
Yes, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, I think there's a lot of energy around voting and democracy reforms because people are earnestly trying to repair the system. I mean, you're asking a bigger question in some ways as to whether the system can be repaired through democracy and voting rights reform. I think a lot of us have to believe that it's so, because to not believe that would probably send us spiraling into despair. We work on sort of what seems possible in what's in front of us. But I mean, if we could convene some sort of I think we have to have a real national conversation on voting and participation. And I mean, maybe that's what comes out of all of this on the other side. I end the book by, I called up Bill Kristol and George Will and all of the conservatives who would agree to sit down with me to sort of try to talk about voting and participation. And I think that there are some thoughtful conservatives who sort of understand that this conversation has to be had and are interested in being part of it. It's probably going to take a different person in the White House to have that conversation. I think that the problems in this country, of course, go deeper than the president, but that in some ways the problems can't be solved until we're not arguing about him, but that we're trying to sort of build another path. And once he's gone, I do think that these conversations will be happening on the other side of the aisle as often as they're happening on the Democratic side of the aisle. And perhaps that is a start, I mean, you're starting to see it on vote by mail, right? I mean, I think that you're seeing on one hand kind of the angry tweets from the White House, but then you're seeing, Michael Steele and Evan McMullen and a lot of people trying to work in nonpartisan ways to try and fix this. And I hope that spirit continues because it has to happen.
Thanks. Let's go to Tiani Coleman from New Hampshire. Tiani, I think you just have to unmute yourself.
Yes, I'm just wondering what role you think timing plays in passing democratic reforms. I ask this because, as independent voters, we support most of the reforms that you write about. And these are reforms that have been talked about for a while, but most of them, and now they're starting to pass. But as independents, we also support some of the newer reforms, such as the top 2 and top 4 nonpartisan primaries. So I'm wondering if you think that these grassroots movements need to be in the public consciousness for a while before they can take enough root to be successful with the activists, or how can we speed up the passage of these newer reforms?
It's tricky. Yeah, it's a great question. The trick, I think, is that we're trying to get these reforms passed, but they have to be passed by the two parties who are in power in so many of these places. And that makes it super complicated because things don't move through these legislatures if they don't have a base in one side or the other. And as soon as these ideas have got a base on one side, the other side hates it and thinks it's out to get them. It's really tricky. I think that there are ways, though, to have all of these conversations change. I mean, I think about Justin Amash and how he was thinking about a libertarian run for the White House and decided against it. And in the weeks in which he was pondering this seriously, right, you had Republicans and Democrats both screaming at him that he was going to tip the election to the other side. He was going to be the spoiler. In Michigan, he might have been a spoiler and let Trump carry the state again. In other states, he might have taken Republican votes and tipped it towards Biden. So there's a solution here, right? I mean, ranked choice voting is a great solution here. And it's helpful for Amash and the libertarians and the independents because they get a seat at the table in some ways without having to be called a spoiler all the time. And people can actually vote for the independent candidate and not worry that they're electing the major party candidate that they like at the least, that they don't have to do that crazy calculus of looking at the polls and figuring out what's going on. Oh, there's a bunny rabbit hopping outside. Sorry, that's when I'm distracted by outside my window. It's the cutest thing. but it's also good for the Democrats and the Republicans, because the Democrats in Michigan were screaming at Amash because they didn't want the election tipped away from them. Well, in that case, sign up for it and embrace a ranked choice voting. You won't have to worry about having the election tipped away from you. These are reforms that I think can be cast in ways that are good for the two parties and are good for independent voters and are good for all democracy. So, you know, I would hope that the libertarians and Amash and others may take this moment, if they're, you know, not in this race in an active way, to really get behind these issues of electoral reform. And I would hope that folks in both parties, in the Democratic and Republican side, are thinking about this as well. I mean, you had 17 candidates running for president on the Republican side in 2016, and you ended up with a nominee who had usually between 35 and 38% support in that party. You had 24 candidates running on the Democratic side this year. And up until everybody kind of got out on Super Tuesday Eve and coalesced behind Biden, people thought this was going to be a fractured convention and a split party. If we use ranked choice voting within the two parties to elect a nominee, imagine we would actually have a consensus nominee coming out of this. So, you know, a combination of open primaries and ranked choice voting really, I think, goes a long way towards giving independents that seat back at the table again.
Just an interesting thing to add here to what Tiani's raising and what you're sharing, Dave. Interesting story. You tell the story of the RCV campaign so well in the book. And there's a little footnote that I just wanted to share with everybody, which, as people remember, RCV passed and then the legislature basically refused to implement it. And it forced the RCV campaign to go back out and do what was called a people's veto in the dead of winter, repetition and put the thing back on the ballot again. And to force the state to enforce it. And it appeared on a June primary ballot where RCV was being used for the first time. And it was a very, very intense vote. Independent voters can't vote in Maine, even though there's more independents in Maine than Democrats or Republicans, and they pay for the primaries. But it was independent voters. I actually was in the state with Tiani that day. Independent voters came out in droves, even though they couldn't vote in the primary for candidates. They came out to support RCV. And so I think you see something there about the character of this new community of voters. Now somewhere in the order of 42 to 44% of Americans consider themselves independent. So just to add that in the mix of this very interesting moment and engine for reform.
So important.
We have a ton more questions than we're going to get to, but let's quickly go to Harry Kresge in New York.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Great. Dave, well, thanks for being here and for writing your book, which is very inspiring and upbeat. I thought Kathy's opening touched on something that, as reformers, it's important for us to address both for ourselves and for the rest of the country, which is, how do you reach out and overcome our own cynicism and despair, and the cynicism and despair that abounds in the aftermath of the murder of Mr. Floyd, the pandemic? What do we reformers have to offer that can take on the whole picture and the social, political, moral crisis that the country is undergoing? How do we not simply want to get out in the street and protest, but how can we make that connection, which is so important?
It's a great question. You know, I mean, I think that we have we've done this to ourselves. And I think that until we recognize, and you're right, I mean, and Kathy said it so eloquently at the beginning, and I won't even come close to that. Some of this does feel sort of meaningless at a moment like this. The idea that if we, you know, have ranked choice voting, we won't have, you know, cops killing people in the street, and it will fix centuries of institutional racism. It's not going to happen, right? But we need a better way of solving problems. And I think that our electoral system has divided us and intentionally fomented so many of these divisions. And that if we're able to change that system, we can at least start talking about these problems in different ways again. And that's what we need to do. We have to find a way to talk to one another in a different way and solve problems. And the current way isn't working. And, you know, I was staggered to go to Florida and Alabama and I mean, I've worked on these issues and in politics for, you know, a long time. And I didn't entirely realize the connections between felon voting laws and the Jim Crow era and how all of this was institutionalized in state constitutions in the days after the Civil War, and how this is all very much a remnant of white people trying to keep control of when it had come time for them to share that control in a more pluralistic system. And the response was to essentially, you know, black codes and Jim Crow laws, and these laws still ensnaring people to this very day. We've got a lot of work to do. These systems that we are working with are not only broken, but they've been wired to be deeply and profoundly, I mean, unfair is too weak of a term, you know. I mean, I went back and read some of the constitutional debates in Alabama and Florida around this, and they talk about white supremacy. Clearly, you know, that was the intention of this constitutional language. And, you know, both parties, this isn't a left or right or a Democratic or Republican thing. We've got deep issues. And so much of the problems we have, I think, right now over voting and democracy issues come down to questions of power and fear in a changing nation. So it's not, in some ways, all that different from those earlier times. And until we really start looking at how these systems work and who they work for and who they have deliberately been designed to exclude, we are not going to, we're not going to solve our problems, but we're also not going to achieve our promise as a nation.
Thank you for that.
We are almost out of time. I'm going to see if we can do one more very, very quick question. We're going to go to Mike. No, it's wonderful. We just have so many wonderful questions.
And complicated, and I keep talking.
That's good. No, it's all good. All good. We're going to go to Mike Rakowski, but I just want to share that we've just got so many comments and thanks for the book. And I just want to read Sonia's comment here. Thank you, David, for sharing your journey. As a Latina from Michigan, I and a lot of Black, brown friends always feel like neither party represents who we are, nor voice truly what our needs are to participate in true democracy. Thanks, Sonia, for sharing that. Mike, can you ask your question really quickly?
I'll go as quickly as I can. Just real quick, of course you're right on Jim Crow, but the update was under Nixon when what's his name? Ehrlichman said specifically that the war on drugs was all about criminalizing black folks. You know that. But years ago, I was in New England. I was very involved in the prison reform movement, and we had success for a while. Hit an absolute ceiling when you saw this very negative attitude toward offenders from citizens. And so when Amendment 4 passed in Florida, I was stunned. I says, wow, how did they ever get that kind of margin in particular? And I couldn't figure it out until I read your book. And I thought you did a great job explaining. And it goes back to Frank Luntz with words, you know, but how the eligibility and the word choices were so impressive. My question is, in Arizona, where I am now, they have terrible restrictions on ex-offenders regaining that eligibility. And what do you see as the prospect for what has been really started strongly in Florida to have the opportunity to gain a foothold in other states across the country?
I think this is an issue that we are going to be hearing an awful lot about, and you can begin to see things changing on this, right? I mean, 64% of voters in Florida voted to hand voting rights back to those who had served a prison term. This was 10% of the adult population, about 20% of the adult adult African-American male population there. I mean, an awful lot of people. And it happened because when you're talking about numbers that large, everybody knows somebody, right? I mean, you've got, you know, neighbors. If you've got 5 houses around you, it probably means, you know, I mean, 1 in 10 is in your backyard. And so they were able to frame the messaging in that debate around second chances and fairness, and they were able to build just this impressive left-right, black-white, you know, churchgoers and you know, bike riding deplorables on the other hand. And it was a really amazing campaign. You don't win anything with 64% of the vote in Florida, right? I mean, the governor's races, the US Senate races, the last couple times down there, presidential races, you know, they can be 527 votes, right? In 2000, I mean, the governor's race, the Senate races were super close. If 64% of people are getting behind this, I think you know you've got something, and that Americans understand this as being a question of fundamental fairness. And I think that's the amazing thing about what passed in 2018, whether we're talking about redistricting or felon voting rights or ranked choice or Medicaid expansion. I think that there is, and I hope that this gives us hope as we head into 2020 and voting in a pandemic, that we can do this, because to most Americans, these are still elemental questions of fairness. They're questions of right and wrong, not right and left. And they still resonate with people, that there might be partisans of either side who are trying to mess around with these rights and these lines, but voters across the board get it, respond, show up at the polls, understand it. You might be told, you know, I'm sure Katie was told this a million times, right. Gerrymandering, it's wonky, people don't get it, they fall asleep. This is something people care about. They care passionately about it. They understand it. They don't like it. And together, all of us really can build the kind of country back that we want. You know, I mean, I like to talk about, you know, Martin Luther King and his moral arc of the universe being long but bending toward justice. And I've said this before, and you know, I talk about it in the book, but it doesn't bend towards justice by itself. It bends when all of us grab it and pull it toward justice, and you can't take your hands off of it. You know, you can win felon voting rights in Florida, and then the legislature's going to try to change it. Hands have got to be on the arc, aware, pulling it in the right direction all the time. This is not a part-time job. Being a citizen in a democracy and creating the kind of democracy we want is a full-time, active participation responsibility that all of us have.
Thank you.
Perfect final comment there. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. We are out of time. Stay with me for a moment. I have a couple of announcements. But first, thank you so much, everyone. Wonderful conversation. Thank you, Dave, for being with us tonight. Really great to spend the hour together in these very tense and intense times. We promise we're going to go out and keep creating stories for you to write about and take further this movement. And here are a couple of announcements. I am going to be announcing our next selection, our summer selection, in the next few weeks. If you have a book that you have loved, some people have already made some suggestions in the chat, please email me at kathy.stewart5, the number, @gmail.com. It can be historical fiction, a nonfiction book. Please send your suggestions. It's very helpful to me. Tell me why you think they'd be good for us to read. Dave has just put his Gmail account in there. If you want to email Dave follow-up questions, go for it. 2 invitations from our 2 host organizations tonight, Independent Voting and The People. The first is an invitation for all those independents on the line tonight. Independent Voting is conducting a national survey. It's called Confronting a New Reality, Independents Speak Out. The survey is an opportunity for independents to share our political experiences and perceptions as the coronavirus crisis has unfolded, and to reimagine some new ways forward. 2,900 independents across the country have participated to date. If you haven't yet taken the survey, go to independentvoting.org. It's right on the homepage. Take the survey and share it in your networks. And the second is an invitation from the people. It's an invitation to join our SAFE challenge, SAFE for Safe and Secure Elections. The open letter urges state and federal elected officials to ensure that every American can vote safely and securely from home this November. And it is also a pledge that as Americans, we're going to come together, get organized, put party loyalty aside, and work together, as we've been talking about all night, to bend that arc and to fix our democratic republic, rule by rule and state by state. Please go to thepeople.org, and under the Get Involved tab, you can see the SAFE Challenge. Please sign it and share it widely. Good night, everyone. Stay safe and happy reading. Take care. Thanks.